only with you all today, whoops, but to welcome Chris into our conversation and to learn from Chris and to have this great conversation. Um, we're a little bit past the hour, so I'm gonna not spend too much time introducing myself, but just saying, the time we spent together this summer learning about the history of race, the history of racism in this country, and the impacts that we feel every day was quite powerful, not only for myself, but my other colleagues who participate. And so we just want to thank you all for welcoming us into your space, into your community, and learning with us. We learned a lot from you all, and it's just really excited to see how you all continue your journey for anti-racism, for liberation, and for love in our community, in our Washington, D.C. And so during that time, we really wanted to, a lot of conversation came up from you all and from the other participants and the cohort participants about wanting to learn more about the history of DC, the Black history of DC, how the movements got started and how all of that kind of led to present day. And so we're just really excited to have the opportunity to have a historian with us, one of our favorite authors that writes about DC that we can learn from and learn with. Chris Myers Asch here with us today. So this is very much a conversation. We want you all to participate as much as possible. So if you have questions or comments, please put those in the chat. We're going to have an opportunity at the end to have Q&A with Chris. But if any kind of questions pop up in the meantime, please put those in the chat. If you have any resources you want to share about DC or anything we're talking about, put those in the chat as well. We want this definitely to be a two-way exchange as much as possible. So with that, Judy, I'm going to go ahead and spotlight Chris if I can. Can I spot? Oh, I can't. I don't have that. I don't have those permissions. But Sarah, I don't know if we could spotlight Chris and myself so we can kind of get us on the screen and kind of have this fireside chat. And Chris, I want to just, while we're doing that, I want to just turn it over to you and give you a few minutes and ask for a self-introduction. And in your self-introduction, could you answer the question about why you and your co-author were inspired to write this book, and what were you all hoping to accomplish? So I'm going to turn it over to you for a self-introduction and ask that you answer those first two questions.
Sure. Thank you so much for the invitation. I really enjoy doing these kinds of talks because that's why we wrote the book. We wanted to share what we know, what we've learned about the history of DC with folks in the community, especially folks in the community who are active and care about the city and care about justice and care about making the city more of an egalitarian place. So my name is Chris Myers Asch, and I wrote the book with my friend Derek Musgrove, who couldn't be here with us today. We often do a tag team presentation, but I'm going solo today. And I wrote the book primarily because I love the city. I grew up in DC. I went to the high school formerly known as Wilson, which is now Jackson Reed School up in Northwest. And that's, a little example of how the world has changed significantly since Chocolate City came out. And I was part of the effort to get that name changed because it's a better reflection of the city and the school and the students who go there. So I'm very proud. I haven't gotten a Jackson Reed sweatshirt yet or any gear, but I will. And I grew up in DC in the 1980s. DC was a very different city. And DC at that time was really, it was going through a difficult period. It was during the crack epidemic. And I remember I took DC history at Deal Junior High, and there was a teacher of mine who it was a required course. Everybody had to take the course. And I can remember she passed out the books on the first day of school, and she said, "Look, I know we're supposed to spend a whole semester on DC history, but we'll spend about 6 weeks on DC history and then move on to world history," was what she really wanted to teach. And she said, because DC doesn't really have any history. And that phrase stuck out. I was just like in ninth grade. So I didn't know much DC history myself at that time, but I knew that there was something really wrong about what she said. I mean, the idea that a DC public school teacher teaching DC history to DC students would be so dismissive of the city's history was something that stuck with me. I was proud of DC and proud of growing up there, and you don't want to see your hometown disrespected like that. And I grew up, became a historian, and started teaching at UDC. That's where I met Dr. Musgrove, Derek, my friend, and we were teaching the DC history classes together. And we really felt like there needed to be like one book that would really help our students understand the city. That at that point in time, it was the early 2000s, and the city was changing a lot demographically. There were a lot of newcomers coming in and sort of acting as if they discovered this place, and this place had no history before I arrived, kind of thing. And we wanted to help native Washingtonians and newcomers alike understand the city and really understand the role that race in particular has played in shaping the city. And so we decided to get together and write this book. And in some ways it's like 30 years later, but it was kind of a response to that DC history teacher who dissed our city and pretended as if it didn't have a rich history. And she's wrong. It has a very rich history, a very a tumultuous history, often disturbing history, but also an inspiring history. And I'm sorry if I'm talking too fast at times.
No, that's great, Chris. Thanks so much. And I just wanted to say hello and welcome to some new folks who have joined, and a reminder about joining the language channel. And if the interpreters could put that in the chat, that would be great, in Spanish. And so, Chris, our next question is Chocolate City. What does that term mean? When and how did DC become the Chocolate City?
Yeah, that was actually the first thing that Derek and I agreed upon. It took about 2 seconds to say, hey, we're just going to call it Chocolate City. Of course, we're writing about race in DC. And it's funny because that term means different things to different people. But I remember having dinner with my wife's cousins who live out in Bethesda, and I mentioned this project I was working on with my colleague. I was very excited about it. We were going to write about race in DC. We're going to call it Chocolate City. And my wife's cousin, young white woman in her 20s, her eyes got wide open. She got really upset and agitated. She said, Chocolate City, are we even allowed to say that? And, it was, I thought about it because it was funny because she heard the term Chocolate City and she thought, oh my gosh, that's a racist term. You can't use that, as a white person. We can't use that as white people, in her mind. And it was funny to me because it never occurred to me that somebody would think of that as a negative thing. Growing up in DC in the 80s, that was just what folks called the city. It was a Black majority city. It was a center of Black culture and consciousness and politics. And like, what's wrong with that? But I think that there is kind of this reaction among many white people that anything associated with Blackness is somehow bad and something to be ashamed of or to hide from. And what we wanted to do with that term is situate race in the city as the primary animating force in the city, and to argue that DC was a chocolate city in some ways from the very beginning, because the presence of a large and active Black population is the single most important dynamic in the city's history. And so if you don't understand the role of the Black experience in the city, you can't understand the development of the city as well. You don't even understand why the city is placed where it is, on the banks of the Potomac, rather than having the national capital in Philadelphia or New York. And so the term Chocolate City, we trace all the way back to the founding and before the founding of the city. But the term as a nickname for the city really comes about in the 1960s as DC gains a Black majority in terms of population, and it's really a magnet for Black activists and Black educators and Black uh, Black folks who are interested in creating a center of Black pride and culture. And people flocked to DC from all over in the 1960s. And, radio DJs started using the term Chocolate City to describe the city. And then it's immortalized, of course, in 1975 with Parliament Funkadelics' Ode to DC, Chocolate City, their album, which pays homage to the city. And our book, our cover also pays homage to the Parliament color, which they use the same color schemes and things, because that kind of immortalized DC as the original chocolate city. It was the first city in the nation, major city in the country to have a Black majority, and we use it to really describe the centrality of the Black experience in particular to the history of the city. There it is right there. Thank you, Jamila.
Thank you so much, Chris. Sorry, folks, we forgot to drop that book title in the chat. Maybe Platform Hope can get some books out to the families. Chris, you talked about the activism a little bit, and I think that's a great segue into helping us understand kind of the history of activism in DC. You mentioned the 60s and the 70s as a period where Black people from around the country, around the world, were flocking to DC. Can you help us understand the rich and unique history of local activism in DC and how local activism led to this the center, DC kind of being the center of the Black Power movement? So how the local expanded and was centered to having DC be the center of the Black Power movement.
Sure, and actually I'm going to take your question because you didn't put 2 digits in front of the 60s, so I'm going to assume you're talking about the 1860s and 1870s, because really, I mean, DC has been a capital of Black America going way back, and a center of Black activism going way back. I think the era of the Civil War and Reconstruction, especially Reconstruction, which happens after the Civil War, is not very well known and not very much appreciated in overall American history, and especially in DC. I mean, Reconstruction was a really exciting time in DC. Black activists pushed early on to get the right to vote. Black men were in DC were the first Black men to gain the right to vote right after the Civil War ends. And they start exercising it. In the first election, it was actually in Georgetown, a mayoral election in Georgetown, and Black voters oust the incumbent mayor, who was notoriously racist and had tried to keep free Black people from moving into the city. And the next year, they vote in an abolitionist white mayor who immediately starts appointing Black police officers to the police force, Black firemen to the fire department, giving public contracts to Black businesses and Black workers in ways nobody's seen before. Black and white voters working together vote for an interracial, what they called a board of aldermen, kind of like the city council, and they passed the most progressive legislation the world really has ever seen. So in 1869, 1870, there were anti-segregation laws passed in DC saying it's illegal to discriminate on the basis of race in any public business. And they list them all out. They're like, no discrimination in taverns, in saloons, in ice cream. They list everything out. And this is 100 years before the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And so you have Black men who are winning office from every ward in the city. The ward system was a little different then than it is now, but they're winning election to a local office and citywide office. And DC really was a center of Black power in the 1860s and early 1870s. And Derek and I write a lot about what happens in the 1870s, because that flourishing of interracial democracy was very frightening to a lot of people, especially in Congress. And at the end of the day, DC is a creature of Congress. It's created as a federal city. under control of the National Congress. And so in the early 1870s, starting first by creating a territorial government in 1871, and then 3 years later, abolishing every elected office in the city, I mean, Congress basically strips the city of any kind of democratic functions because it was worried about Black voters and white voters working together in the city. So by 1874, nobody gets to vote. No white men or Black men get to vote because Congress figured it was easier to just appoint 3 commissioners, and all 3 were white men until the 1960s. And then 1 Black man was appointed. No women were ever appointed city commissioners. And those city commissioners were in charge of the city all the way up through into the 1970s. So there was no elected board of education, no elected mayor, no elected city, nothing. All had to go through these 3 white men who were the city commissioners. And Congress found that just much easier to deal with. And so we saw in the 1860s and 1870s that fear of Black political power and really interracial coalitions drove this very anti-democratic movement to disenfranchise the city. I mean, if you fast forward a century, I mean, after World War II, there's another interracial movement to fight back against segregation in the city. And one of the things that they find is that those laws that they passed in Reconstruction in the 1860s and 70s, they were never repealed. What they'd done is they just left them out of the books. Literally, they just deleted those those laws to pretend as if they didn't exist, but they were not repealed. And so civil rights activists after World War II, doing research on the city's laws, they found the laws and they said, oh, look what these activists left us as a legacy. Let's use them. And those became the basis of the post-World War II civil rights movement in the city. Again, locally based, Black and white, driven by Black activists who used the city's role as federal capital to bring attention to the injustices that were here. And this was the time of the Cold War, right? So America's going around the world saying, we're the leader of the free world. Join us in this battle against the Soviet Union. And so activists seized on that and said, look, if you're going to claim to be the leader of the free world, you got to start right here in the nation's capital. This is the nation's living room. This is where people from around the world look when they look at America. And how can you have segregation and injustice here? And they use that as a lever to win a lot of really important civil rights victories long before Brown versus Board of Education or the Montgomery bus boycott. So DC integrated its public facilities, integrated its public businesses, got rid of housing segregation, the racially based covenants in housing. And then when Brown versus Board of Education was passed, we had a separate case called Bolin v. Sharp. DC actually integrated its schools in a way that was unusual for anywhere in the South. And it was largely because we are DC, we are the capital. And so a lot of those advances were made even before the national civil rights movement took off. The problem was, even though those legal achievements were made, in the intervening years, as the civil rights movement flourished across the South, and there are all these confrontations and all this activism in the rest of the South, there wasn't a whole lot of change going on in DC that was very positive. And so a new generation of activists comes along after the Civil Rights Act is passed, after the Voting Rights Act is passed, and they say, wait a minute. We can get the right to vote in Selma, Alabama, and we can't in DC, right? Because DC still was ruled by 3 city commissioners. And so many civil rights activists, particularly from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who'd been very involved in the Deep South, after those victories had been won, they looked around, they said, well, where should we go now? Many of them, including Marion Barry, who was the chairman at one point of SNCC, decide they're going to move to DC. It's a majority Black city. It has nothing. It has no voting whatsoever. And so they come to DC and really help to supercharge this movement toward home rule, which we get in 1973. That was a long answer to your question, but maybe you have other more specific questions we can talk about.
No, thank you, Chris. That was a great answer. One of the things that just popped up, a quick question, and I'm going to take us off track a little bit. You mentioned DC integrated its schools differently than most Southern Confederate states, former Confederate states at the time. Could you just talk about a little bit about that, how DC integrated it differently so we can maybe understand the legacies that are still here?
So part of it is that Dwight Eisenhower was really concerned about Soviet propaganda, and his administration was worried that if DC didn't integrate its schools, here you had this big internationally recognized decision in Brown versus Board and Bowling v. Sharp in DC, and people are paying attention. And across the Deep South, the leaders made it very clear they had no intention whatsoever of desegregating their schools, and they did everything they could. In the intervening years, you see riots anytime there are black children or black students trying to integrate a school or a college. There are senators from the South writing manifestos about how they're not going to integrate ever, and impeach Earl Warren, who was the Chief Justice at the time. Those billboards all across the South. So they made it clear that they would not listen. They called it massive resistance. They said, if we show massive resistance, eventually the federal government's going to give up and go home. Kind of like what happened a century earlier after the Civil War, right? After the Civil War, with Reconstruction, as we discussed, there's a huge racial revolution for several years. Amendments to the Constitution, laws passed, interracial state governments and city governments. And the white South just resisted. And eventually the federal government gave up and pulled away. And that was the strategy of white segregationists after Brown as well. If we massively resist, they're going to give up and go home. And in DC, it was a little different, in part because Dwight Eisenhower, who was no civil rights activist himself, but he was very nervous about what the Soviet Union would do with this propaganda if they didn't. And so he made it clear that he thought it was important for DC to integrate. So DC does integrate, not very quickly, sort of kicking and screaming in some ways among white parents. There were protests. White parents protested in Anacostia. But by the fall of 1955, you started to see the beginnings of school desegregation in DC, and it happened slowly and unequally. And the schools on the west side of Rock Creek Park are largely untouched for many years, but it starts to happen, and white parents largely look at this as a sign that this is going to take place all over, even in places in west of the park, and they start taking their kids out of the schools in droves. Sometimes sending them to private schools, sometimes just moving to Maryland or Virginia, where it's the schools are still segregated at that point in time, and so the white population, student population, plummets in the years after Brown.
Well, Chris, what I think is so interesting about the book, and thank you for reading for your comment. I'm getting a crash course history of DC. I can lecture my kids. Thanks for that. What I think is so interesting about your book, which I did finally finish this summer, it's a long book, but very interesting, is reading all of these names of streets and schools and neighborhoods that I encounter on a daily basis, and how much I realize I don't know about the history of each one of them. So the Platform of Hope, for example, is very firmly rooted in Ward 1 in the Mount Pleasant, Adams Morgan, and Columbia Heights community. I was wondering, could you talk a little bit about the history of organizing in Adams Morgan specifically, since it was such an important site, and a little bit about how the community that exists today came about?
Okay, you can hear me now. So Yeah, so Adams Morgan is has always been well, not always been an eclectic place. It became a much more eclectic place in the years after World War II. Many of those neighborhoods, Mount Pleasant, Adams Morgan, what became known as Adams Morgan late after desegregation, Columbia Heights, they originally were built as what were called streetcar suburbs. What's interesting about DC and a lot of cities is that they were actually much more integrated in terms of where people live. They're much more integrated in the 1800s than in the mid and late 1900s. And the reason for that is that people walked to work. And so if Black people were, say, domestics, they often lived in the house with the white family, or they might live a block or two away. I remember finding this wonderful city directory from 1860 where the richest businessman lived on H Street, and two doors down was a domestic who lived there with her family, and then three doors, and next to a mechanic, next to, it was much more integrated in terms of race and class because everybody had to live within walking distance of their job. What happens in the late 1800s is that streetcars are invented and developed, and streetcars make it possible for people to live further away. And so if the city is getting congested and there's a sense that, oh, it's dirty, it's congested, all these people bunched together, people with means, wealthier people, started to look to the outskirts. And at the time, Mount Pleasant, Columbia Heights, that was outside the city. That was pasture land, right? That was beyond the original city that L'Enfant drew out, which was basically Florida Avenue was the northern border, and beyond that was mostly just kind of rolling hills and countryside. And so the streetcars and developers who start to develop these suburbs out there, they start to realize, look, we can make a killing out here. We're gonna create these planned subdivisions, and they're going to be economically exclusive because the only folks who can live out here are the people who can afford to buy these big houses that we're gonna build, and it's going to be marketed as being racially exclusive. And they were. So a lot of Calorama and all these other places that kind of ring the city, they started out as largely white and wealthy suburbs of the city. And it's not really until after World War II that you start to see significant in-migration of lower income, often Black families moving into these neighborhoods. And as they do in the 20s and 30s, and especially in the 40s, white homeowners try to protect their enclave with racially restrictive covenants written into real estate deeds, basically saying, we promise never to sell our property to a Black person. Or if there's a whole list, they would have, Jews, Persians, they would list all these different categories of people that they wouldn't sell to. Well, in 1948, the Supreme Court ruled that those racially restrictive covenants were not enforceable. And so that helps break down a lot of the legal barriers to integrating Mount Pleasant, Columbia Heights, and other neighborhoods that had been so segregated. And in Mount Pleasant in particular, you see the growth of a Latino community. At the time, they called it the Latin community, which largely had not existed in this city the way it had grown in other places. DC, because it was the home of the federal government, and because of its history of slavery, it did not attract a large immigrant population for many, many decades. If you think of Boston or New York or other industrial cities of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they're attracting hundreds of thousands of Polish immigrants and Italian immigrants and Jewish immigrants, all these folks who are attracted by the industrial jobs of those cities. DC wasn't an industrial city. It was a federal government city. And so it was largely a clerk city. And because of its history of slavery, there was an impoverished Black kind of underclass. And immigrants largely avoided areas like that. So immigrants largely avoided the South for many, many decades into the mid and late 20th century, because you would get paid less, because the presence of low-income Black population meant that employers could pay Black workers and immigrant workers much less than they would elsewhere. So not until the the mid 20th century do you see the growth of a discernible Latino community, and that grows out of a lot of the embassies that start to pop up in the along 16th Street corridor and elsewhere in Mount Pleasant, what we now call Adams Morgan, and many of the people who worked there, not just the diplomats, but also the folks who moved with the diplomats to take care of their house and their children and their garden, they decided to stay. And so they would move into the areas around the embassies and the foreign legations, and started to put down roots and started to bring their family members over and started to open little shops and restaurants over time. And we talked a lot about Carlos Rosario in the book and the role that he played. He was from Puerto Rico, and he comes to work for the federal government, and he recognizes that there's really very little understanding of Spanish speakers in the city. The city largely sees itself as Black and white, and he starts to carve out space for a Spanish-speaking Latin community, as he called it. And so he would bring people together for social dances, for Independence Day, and he would celebrate the Independence Day of every country. So the Colombian Independence Day and Ecuadorian and every Independence Day as a way to bring Spanish speakers together and help them form relationships, help them find housing or work, just a way to connect people. And that community starts to grow stronger in the 1960s and really become more politically active in the 1960s. And Rosario's leading that charge. He becomes widely known as an influential political figure. He goes into the city government to try to organize people to recognize that first of all, that there are Latinos in the city, and that there are a lot more of them than people thought, and to advocate for them within the city government. And so there's some conflicts with some of the civil rights activists who are trying to who are worried about diluting the activist energy. But his point is like, look, we're here too. We have the same interests, right? We want to make this an accessible, open, welcoming, just city, and we're part of that city as well.
Thank you so much for that history. I see that Zulma has a question. Jamila, are we ready for questions? Great. Zulma, go ahead.
Take Zulma's question and kind of go back into our conversation, but I think Zulma has something that's right on point. So let's let Zulma ask a question. And please, everyone, if you have questions while we're talking, you can raise your hand or pop them in the chat.
No, I just want to say that now I understand why the reason we are advocate for education and try to treat different the kids, that they are bilingual. The system doesn't know yet how to deal with those kids. So, and now I understand why that reason. So that because another state like New York or Los Angeles, they are more available to deal with that because they have the immigration before and they know how to usually work with them.
That's a very good point. You think about Los Angeles. I mean, there's been such a Latino presence going back centuries, right? In that part of the country, and people who have been active and pushing for racial justice and language access and everything else there, and we've had that history too. It's just much shorter than in other places, and it took a long time. we write about Carlos Rosario's efforts in the 60s and 70s, and then you see an influx of Salvadoran immigrants in the 1980s. So of course, DC has this enormous Salvadoran population by the mid-late 1980s, and many of those immigrants who come here really get frustrated with the city government, which by that time is run by Marion Barry and his administration, and they feel shut out of the city administration and not heard, right? And so these tensions build and explode in 1991 with unrest in Mount Pleasant and people getting really, really angry. And it's a lot of the same anger that blows up in 1968 in the Black communities. This idea that we're not heard. Here we are. We have these struggles. We have these issues we want you to address, but you're not listening. We have no voice in the government. Listen to us. And if you won't listen to us when we're peaceful and going to meetings and writing letters and doing all the right, if you won't listen to us, then maybe we've got to get your attention a different way.
Thank you, Chris. Could you talk to us a little bit about that 1991 revolt? The first time I actually heard about it was reading your book and following some of the work that you do. I think less is known about 1991 than 1968. But help us.
Yeah. It wasn't nearly as widespread as the 1968 disturbances, and so it doesn't register the same way that 68 did. And it was very much localized in Mount Pleasant. It spills over a little bit into Adams Morgan and Columbia Heights, but it's very localized in the Latino community in Mount Pleasant. And it's sparked, like a lot of these confrontations are, by a police interaction with a community member, and it was a Black police officer who was trying to arrest a young Latino man, and he ends up getting shot. Rumors spread. People are very angry, and again, tensions have been building up for years by this point. So it's not like this is just the one thing. They've been building up for years. Many Latinos in Mount Pleasant feel disrespected by the police force and more largely the city government, and feel like this was a dramatic example of somebody being very hurt. And the rumor went that he'd been killed. He was not killed, but he was hurt by this police officer when all he was doing was hanging out with his friends in the park. And so it explodes. At that point, Sharon Pratt Dixon, later Sharon Pratt Kelly, after her marriage, she's in charge. So Marion Barry is out of office, and Sharon Pratt Dixon is in charge. This is kind of the first test of her leadership, and she really tries to do what Walter Washington did in 1968, which is calm the situation down. She tries to get the police force to disengage, like don't make matters worse, get away, don't shoot people who are in the streets, and tries to have a big presence. The violence dies down relatively quickly. There's much less damage than in 68, and the mayor says all the right things. She says, oh, we're going to have more Latino presence in my administration. We're going to form a committee to study these issues and so forth. But not much progress is made. And so very quickly, Latino leaders get frustrated with the lack of progress, in the same way that many Black leaders got frustrated in the years after 1968 to say, wait a minute, we thought this was going to be a new beginning, and it hasn't been.
Oops. Thank you. Just a reminder, any questions for Chris, please put those in the chat or put your hands up. Chris, thank you for this wonderful history lesson. It just, we think about kind of how did we get to present day DC, and something that comes up a lot in my thinking, in research and questioning too is, how did we get here from DC having such a robust Black population 20, 30 years ago, of being a 70% Black majority, to DC now being about, I think it's like 45% or 44%, something like that, of the population. And so wanted to know where and how did Black and Latinidad displacement start in DC, and how did it spread so quickly where you look at a span of 30, 40 years, the population has just almost halved?
It's a great question, and at some point, I hope we can talk about urban renewal and its effects on the city. And, well, maybe I'll start with that, because urban renewal. Not a lot of folks know much about the history of urban renewal. It's really, really important in DC to understand what's happening in DC, because at the same time that you have this really exciting movement towards expanded civil rights, the dismantling of segregation, the integration of schools, and eventually culminating in home rule, all that is exciting in the 50s and 60s and 70s. The rise of Black power and civil rights in the city. At the same time, there's also a movement toward what was called urban renewal. And this comes out of the late 1940s and 1950s, where government officials working with developers and bankers, with support from the press and from Congress, like every major power holder in the city is in support of urban renewal. And the idea behind urban renewal was, oh, we've got these cities that are decaying and they're blighted, and we need to clear them out and kind of start over. We're going to clear out all these buildings. We're going to build new, have all these new developments and bring back all these folks who've been leaving the city. Now, mind you, the irony is, of course, this is happening at the same time that other parts of the federal government are funding suburbanization for white GIs and veterans coming home from the wars. And they're giving low interest loans to these segregated areas in the suburbs. Part of the federal government is doing that. Another part is looking at the cities and saying, well, we're going to just start over. We're going to do a clean slate. And DC becomes kind of ground zero of that movement. Why? Because there's nobody there to stop them. Why not? Because people in DC can't vote and they can't organize. They have no power. They have no leverage. The commissioners, right? Say, those three white guys, you just talk to them. They say, okay, boom, we get it done. And so they decide to start in Southwest DC. And basically, they level 99% of the buildings in Southwest DC. Mind you, Southwest DC was probably the most integrated area of the city. It was relatively low income. There was a large Black population. There was also a large immigrant Jewish population and remnants of the old Irish immigrants from the turn of the century. It was not a wealthy area, but it was home to tens of thousands of people who'd been there for generations. Lots of small businesses. They wiped all of that clean. People sued. Went up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, totally fine. Government can take your property and destroy it and give it to developers in the interest of city beautification and city improvement. And that's a case called Berman v. Parker. Most people never heard of it before. In 1955, it basically said, you can do this. Go ahead. Government can take your property and start over. And they did. And so all those low-income folks were removed from the area. Lots of promises made. Oh, after we build, you'll be able to come back. Well, instead of building lots of small, homes and businesses for low and moderate income people, they build high-rise condos, hoping to attract middle and upper class federal workers and others to come, to move back to the city. And so you see in Southwest, right, there are highways all over the place. They're big, condos. Like, that didn't exist 80 years ago. It was all wiped out. And so many activists in the 1960s looked at what happened to Southwest in the 1950s, and they said, hell no, we're not going to let that happen in our part of the city, because the developers thought this was a great success, right? They got all kinds of awards for the architecture. They got great reviews in the press. They got all kinds of, praise from the policy, from the power holders. They said, oh, we'll do this again. In fact, we'll do this in Adams Morgan. So if you ever take the little walking tour, they're the DC history walking tours that you go on. I remember I took a class of mine out there. We talked about just this. They had a whole vision of wiping out Adams Morgan the same way, getting rid of all those, row houses and all that old stuff, and putting in condos, big high-rise condos. The people in Adams Morgan said, not in our neighborhood, no way. And there was a guy, Walter Fauntleroy, who was a reverend, civil rights leader, and a remarkable figure. It's unfortunate he died recently. His memory is fading in the city's history, but he really deserves to be very well remembered, because he started an organization called the Model Inner City Community Organization, in part to stop urban renewal in Shaw and Mount Pleasant, all these areas in the city, because they didn't want to wind up like Southwest, where everybody would be moved out, all the buildings would be flattened, and then these ugly condos would be put in their place. And they were largely successful. And they worked. Also, there was another great movement in the 60s and early 70s to stop the freeways, to stop the highways. And so those activists looked at what happened in Southwest and said, that's awful. Look what happens when you make a neighborhood safe for commuters and you don't care about the people who live there, right? You have these spaghetti strands of highways going everywhere. Well, the developers wanted to do that all over the whole city, to create these 10-lane highways that would crisscross the city, like they do. I don't know if you've ever been to Memphis or New Orleans or a lot of these southern cities. There's just enormous highways that go right through the heart of the city and just slice up the neighborhoods. They stopped those freeways. They eventually got them stopped so that Adams Morgan still looks the way it does and doesn't have a 10-lane highway going through it, or high-rise condos popping up everywhere. And so that activism was critical to stopping the bulldozers, literally. Sometimes they would sometimes chain themselves to the bulldozers, or houses would be condemned. The city would come in and board them up and kick the families out, and activists would come in and unboard the houses, take the boards off, sweep it back up, and move a family back in, to say, you can't do that. You can't just pave over neighborhoods, because you'll destroy people and you'll destroy neighborhoods, and we want to protect them and preserve them. I'm not sure if I can't remember where we started that question, but oh, you were talking about displacement. So, fast forward, I mean, the sad irony is, so now activists preserved bucolic neighborhoods with trees and beautiful row houses, and walking distance to downtown, or walking distance to little community institutions. By the 1990s and early 2000s, you had another mayor, Anthony Williams, who's really committed to development and working with developers to bring more people to, he wanted to bring 100,000 new people to DC, because DC had lost population from the 1950s down to 2000. We lost tens and thousands of people. A lot of Black middle-class folks moved out to PG County. They started calling it Ward 9, because so many Black Washingtonians moved out there for cheaper land, bigger homes, whatever. There were lots of different reasons. And Anthony Williams wants to bring 100,000 new people in. So he feels like he's got to work with the developers to develop the city. And you get this high-powered economic engine that starts revving up in the early 2000s, and people feel like there's money to be made in these very neighborhoods that activists had protected and preserved from highways and condos, that now are these beautiful, have these beautiful row houses and so forth. So developers just kind of flood in and start fixing them up and turning them into luxury condos and apartments, and attracting a much wealthier and largely white population back into the city that they'd fled 50, 60 years earlier. And there's money to be made, a lot of it. And so what happens is that over time, if they're homeowners, small homeowners, they feel like, hey, I've been holding on to this thing. now they're offering me 10 times what I bought. Maybe I'm going to take my money and go buy myself a parcel in PG County. Others, especially renters, don't have that power. Now their rents are just going up and up. They can't afford to live there, so they got to go, and they do, and they start moving out to further away from their jobs and their homes to suburbs where they might be able to afford a place, and so that's fueled by a lot of development money. There's also a lot of money in the region in DC after 9/11 with the rise of the national security state. And so there's tons of money coming into the federal government and into lobbying. And so those lobbyists, they've got a lot of money. They can buy those condos, right? And so you have more people with more money who can outbid folks who've been there for a long time.
Chris, this is so interesting. And it's so, again, when you're saying Carlos Rosario or Walter Fauntroy, I'm just thinking of the school that I walk by every day, or the community center name for Walter in the park. So it's just great to hear how a lot of these local names are actually very recent history. Because we only have 2 minutes left, I just want to, first of all, thank Jamila and Chris again for their time in bringing this about. I've been fangirling ever since Jamila mentioned this is a possibility. I was like, oh my gosh, Chocolate City, so excited. And I'm really happy that we have this beautiful cross section of families and advisory board members here with us and some other guests. Our last question to close us out. And I'll just say, if you have any reactions or questions you'd like to put in the chat, folks who are joining us, we'd love to hear from you. But my last question was, your book was published in 2017. It's 2022, and it's been a really eventful 5 years. So if you were to add a chapter to your book with the last 5 years of DC history, what would you name that chapter of 2017 through 2022?
That's a great question. And historians usually like to get a little bit more distance so they can see what's gonna hold. I might think of it as DC Lives Matter as a chapter title, because what happens in the summer of 2020 is so profoundly important, and really what happens in DC. The political ground shifts very, very suddenly. I think of the statehood movement, for example, which starts out in the 1970s. It's kind of this fringe idea. People, even people who are big supporters of home rule, like Walter Fauntroy, he doesn't support statehood. He's like, no, that's kind of like pie in the sky stuff. Let's focus on what we can accomplish. And he tries to get a voting rights amendment in the Constitution, which passes Congress, doesn't get ratified. But DC people start, really support statehood. It becomes kind of a local DC movement, but no one else in the country is paying attention until summer 2020. And suddenly, after George Floyd, people take to the streets and they're talking about racial justice, and they look around, they say, well, this is one piece of this larger puzzle, because DC, as it was in the 1960s, when you had this whole civil rights struggle and people are voting in Selma and they can't even vote in the nation's capital. Well, here we are talking about freedom and democracy, and look what's happening in our nation's capital. Folks still don't have representation in Congress. There's still no senators or representatives from DC. And suddenly, what had been sort of pie in the sky a month before becomes really a politically, potentially winning idea. And you see national Democrats talking about DC statehood in a way they never did, say, back in the 90s when Eleanor Holmes Norton was trying to get people to talk about it, and national Democrats were like, forget it, we're not talking about that stuff. And now they were seeing this as part of a larger, a piece of this larger puzzle of justice and racial equity in this country. And it is, until we address the imbalance in, the structural imbalance, particularly in the Senate, it's going to be very hard to get real progressive change in politically.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to go to the gallery view so I can see everyone's faces. Thank you all so much for being here with us. And Jamila, just thank you so much. It's been so awesome working with you. We look forward to coming up with some future ways to work with you. And I'll let you have the last word, since you really pulled this together.
Well, Chris, this could go on for hours. I'm a history buff, so anytime we're talking about history, I just love it. I'm actually thinking about going to get an anthropology degree. But thank you all. Thank you for being here. This has been an amazing experience, just being a part of your journey. And I hope you all keep in touch with Blackwoody and with Chris. I don't know, Chris, if you want to share your social media or ways that people can reach out to you and Derek, because we are looking forward to seeing what's happening. And so much happening around the book. And we want to make sure that we can make sure our families be involved and know about what's happening. So please just let us know how to follow, how to know what's happening so we can continue to learn. And with that, I will say thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful Thursday.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Jamila.
Yeah.
Bye, everybody. So good to see so many of you, and looking forward to future gatherings, future thoughts.
Bye, everyone. Bye. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.
All right.